I really want to welcome you to this special Ways of Knowing. We're just thrilled to do this special collaboration with our friends at A.C.T. on the occasion of A.C.T's opening of Tom Stoppard's new play, The Hard Problem. That play is going to be opening on the 19th of October and running to November 13th. We're especially happy to work with A.C.T. because in a sense they're very much of a kindred spirit to the Exploratorium. A.C.T. started in 1967, the Exploratorium started in 1969. We're both sort of products of the zeitgeist of the time in San Francisco during that time. We both had amazingly powerful founding directors. We've both sort of gone through ups and downs, and we're survivors, and we're here now in San Francisco. And I think in particular, we're so proud of being friends with A.C.T. and want to congratulate them on their 50th anniversary. So let's give them an applause. So Ways of Knowing is a title to our series, and it's also a way that we describe our long-standing interest in science, art, and human perception. There are ways of knowing about ourselves and about the world. Tonight we're going to bring you 90 minutes of a mixture of theater and exhibits, art and science, and hopefully some creative conversation. I have a personal interest in this because as a physicist, I, like many of you, have had a lifelong interest in Tom Stoppard. But as a physicist, how can I not like someone who's written not one, not two, but 3 plays about important concepts in physics? Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, about statistics, that opening scene, which is a wonderful scene. Hapgood, which is about the wave-particle duality. And Arcadia, that amazing play about chaos theory. So for me, it's really a wonderful honor to be hosting this program tonight. The Hard Problem is Tom Stoppard's most recent play, and it opened in London in January 2015. The program notes for that production state, the title refers to the hard problem of consciousness, which Stoppard defines as having subjective, first-person experiences. He notes the strangeness in the illusion of consciousness in which clearly you have to be conscious to experience. Amazing problem. So to start us off, we thought we would do a reading, the first scene of the play, and I'd like to invite on stage 2 actors who are actually in the play, Daniel Clegg and Brenda Meany. They'll come up here and do a reading of the first scene. And while they're coming up, I want to remark that Julia Adamo is going to read the stage directions for the team.
Scenes from The Hard Problem by Tom Stoppard. Scene 1, Hillary's bed set. Evening. Hillary and Spike with mugs of coffee.
You're looking at 2 years. The jewelry was under the floorboards. The police have nothing to connect you to the scene of the robbery.
I'm going to vomit.
If you stick to the story, they can only charge you with receiving. With good behavior, you'll be out in a year. On the other hand...
I'm warning you, Spike. Projectile vomiting. If I hear the words prisoner's dilemma, I'm not going to make it to the toilet.
You're being childish. The Kroll is a plum ticket, and the psychology department has published 12 papers on the dilemma, so hang in. The question is, can you trust Bob?
Who's Bob?
Bob is who smashed the jeweler's window while you grabbed the rings and watches.
Oh, Bob.
Bob is who's sticking to the story, you hope. Bob is who's asking himself, can I trust Luann to stick to the story?
Luann?
There's never been a smash and grab jewel raider called Hillary. If Bob turns state's evidence, he'll get off and you'll get 7 years because you stuck to the story, you muggins.
Why would Bob do that except in the Ladybird book of game theory?
In case you do it to him. That's what this is all about. That's why the game is called The Prisoner's Dilemma. 2 rational prisoners will betray each other even though they know they would have done better to trust each other.
Rational? You have to be a person to be rational. You've left out everything about Bob and me except we're each out for ourselves and we've got 2 buttons to push. Actually, Bob loves me.
Hold on.
I did it. Bob had nothing to do with it. He wasn't even there.
That's not one of the options.
I smashed the window, grabbed the jewelry and hid it under the floorboard.
That's not an option in the game.
I'm confessing anyway. I'm going to give Bob a chance to go straight.
Why?
Because I'm good.
Right. Just promise me one thing. Don't pull this one if it comes up in your interview. The game is not about you and Bob. It's about a statistical tendency. It's about survival strategies hardwired into our brains millions of years ago. Who eats, who gets eaten, who gets to advance their genes into the next generation. Competition is the natural order. Self-interest is bedrock. Cooperation is a strategy. Altruism is an outlier unless you're an ant or a bee, and you're not an ant or a bee. You're competing to do a doctorate at the Kroll Institute, where they're basically seeing first-class honors degrees, and you're in line for a second, so don't be a smartass. And above all, don't use the word good as though it meant something in evolutionary science.
Spike tastes his coffee.
Ugh, horrible. Haven't you even got sweetener?
Don't you believe in good, Spike?
I believe in it. It's just not what you think it is.
What do you think it is?
Behavior. It takes millions of years to evolve, but it's evolved behavior whether you're a person or a vampire bat.
A vampire bat.
Every night, vampire bats leave the cave in search of warm blood. When they get back to the cave, the ones who are lucky cough up for the ones who weren't. Literally, they regurgitate some of the blood to feed the bats who came home hungry. Now, do you think these are good vampire bats?
No, I don't. But I don't think they're little people with wings and sonar either.
I didn't want to be the one to break it to you. How many times do you think a bat will refuse to share its dinner before it finds out the next time it comes home hungry, the other bats won't cough up?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Off the top of my head, 4. 4 times, say? That'll teach the selfish little bastard how to behave. I don't think we have much to feel superior about as a species. Altruism is always self-interest. It just takes a little working out.
Like you going miles out of your way to give me a lift home.
Exactly. It's a cost-benefit thing. I go miles out of my way because you might invite me in for coffee, and I throw in a tutorial to get into your
Pants.
good graces, I was going to say. But you're basically right with the biology.
I'd rather not complicate
Hey, it would be an abuse of trust without precedent in higher education.
It's a cost-benefit thing. I'm sorry about the coffee, too. But giving something to get something isn't altruism anyway.
That's what I'm saying.
No, you're not. You're saying there's no such thing, and I'm saying there is. I'm saying Rose of Sharon giving her milk to a starving man is different from bats.
Rose of Sharon. Is she in the Bible?
No, she's in the Grapes of Wrath, you pillock.
Oh, fiction. If you want a tip, don't cite works of fiction.
Rose of Sharon's baby is born dead, so she gives her breast to an old man dying of hunger. A stranger. Just some old man they meet lying in a barn where the family are sheltering from a rainstorm. That's how the story ends, with Rose of Sharon holding a starving man to her breast. Altruism means being good for its own sake.
Didn't it make her feel better, though? About her life, her baby? Didn't it give her the courage to go on and have more babies?
Fuck you, Spike.
Darwin doesn't do sentimental. If you want something cuddly, try business studies. Here, there's only evolutionary biology. Breastfeeding a starving man? EvoBio. The Good Samaritan? EvoBio. Culture, empathy, faith, hope, and charity, all the flip sides of egoism, come back to biology because there ain't anywhere else to come from except the 3 pounds of grey matter wired up in our heads like a map of the London Underground, with 86 billion stations connected 30 trillion ways, all hardwired for me first. How many times do you think I'd drive you home for a mug of what isn't even proper coffee before I give up on the sweetener and let you go home on the bus?
4?
Yeah, at least.
At least.
Yes, at least 4.
Oh.
He offers her a handshake and leaves.
So we'll stage the next reading of a scene in a minute, but now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome to the stage the people responsible for those wonderful words and the way they were said, award-winning playwright Tom Stoppard and A.C.T's artistic director, Ms. Carey Perloff. you have a mic there? Is there should be one?
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
I found
We
one.
actually have 3 here.
I was
So,
sitting on it. Sorry.
well, welcome to both of you to our stage. The term "the hard problem of consciousness" was introduced by philosopher David Chalmers, who said, "The really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whirl of information processing, but there is also a subjective aspect." It's interesting to have something called a hard problem in science, and there's much debate about whether it is a hard problem or not. But I'm curious, Tom, what drew you to this subject in the first place?
Well, I can't remember when the first place was, really. I think that it's something which I'd been just thinking about without thinking about it as being anything to do with writing plays or anything else. It interests me. But then, you know, all the science that people think I know, I only know through reading popular books. I don't read serious scientific works, but I read a lot of, you know, airport paperback science, and I've always loved it. And I guess I started thinking about this much more. Just at that time, you mentioned when David Chalmers, he didn't coin the phrase, but he, as it were, gave it some impact. And that was in the 90s, wasn't it? Right. So, you know, like everybody else in this room, I subscribed to the New York Review, and I read a long piece by John Searle, which was essentially putting the boot into David Chalmers, and a long letter from David Chalmers defending himself, and another. I was fascinated by it. It was much better than Wimbledon. I really loved the whole thing. But it's a difficult subject to start writing about because you don't quite know when to start. There's limitless inquiry is the other option, and you have to stop at some point and find a story because you don't have a play unless you have a story.
So,
Is that right?
yeah, Carey, I was going to ask, but you've been working on staging this play, but what intrigued you about this subject?
Well, I just followed Tom down the rabbit hole wherever, you have to know when you're signing on to one of his plays that you just go into territory you haven't been in before. We've done Dubček and Husek and Czech communism and Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty and, you know, whatever. So, you know, this is, I grew up in a family where my mother's a literary critic and my father was a scientist. She dominated the dinner table conversations, so the humanities sort of had weighed heavier on the scale. And yet, as I got older, I became more and more fascinated at sort of the way he thought. And one day he said something to me, I don't know that this is relevant to the play, but I thought it was so funny that he was a cardiologist, my father. And he said, you know, it's not a coincidence that I chose that organ. And, you know, I sort of thought about that for a while, and I thought everything actually that was about my father, which you wouldn't think had anything to do with anything scientific, and he was a really serious, he created the field of adults with congenital heart disease. This was what my father pioneered. But what he was interested in actually was feeling. Why is it, what does it mean to be heart sick? What is the nature of the feeling of the heart when you're in love? And he researched this in literature and brought it back. And so I've always thought that tipping point is sort of the most interesting thing. And that's what the play traffics in a sense.
Well, so I'm curious about the prisoner's dilemma. And at the risk of getting hit by projectile vomit from Hillary, I thought I would remind folks about the problem. We have 2 exhibits out on our exhibit floor, The Science of Sharing. We actually played with them earlier, which talk about the prisoner's dilemma. And so I thought I would actually talk briefly about the dilemma and show those pictures of those exhibits. So let me do the slide, because the prisoner's dilemma, which I'm going to talk about, here on the back slide is actually the way the dilemma is portrayed. Just to remind you that it's about 2 members of a criminal gang that are arrested and imprisoned. Each prisoner is in solitary confinement with no means of communicating with the other. The prosecutors lack sufficient evidence to convict the pair on the principal charge. They hope to get Moore sentenced to a year in prison on a lesser charge. Simultaneously, the prosecutors offer each prisoner a bargain. Each prisoner is given the opportunity either to betray the other by testifying that the other committed the crime, or to cooperate with the other by remaining silent. So the offer is here on the screen. If A and B each betray each other, each of them serves 2 years in prison. If A betrays B, but B remains silent, A will be free, and B will serve 3 years in prison, and vice versa. If A and B both remain silent, both of them will only serve 1 year in prison on a lesser charge. So, I mean, came out of game theory. It's been talked about a lot around the issue of altruism, why two rational people might not cooperate even if it appears in their best interest to do so. So we actually have a couple exhibits, and I want to show you a picture of them. This is one that's really, it's called Career Criminal. It's actually a classic version of The Prisoner's Dilemma, and you can play with it. I encourage you to go out and play with it. It basically sets up the situation. You get to choose, and you get to see whether you're altruistic or not, whether you've helped each other or not, or you've been self-centered. Here's another picture of that exhibit. But true to form, when our team was building these exhibits, they realized that, this is pretty heady stuff, kind of, have to sit there and sit. So they worked really hard on another exhibit, which is called Trust Fountain. And this is an exhibit that actually does the prisoner dilemma, but in a more playful, lovely way. So it's a fountain. You can either hit, skip, sip, or squirt for the other person, right? And then the other person is the same thing. They can do sip or squirt. And depending on what happens, you go through and you either get penalized or you get a nice drink of water. So I actually have a short video here to show you in action. As they're lining up, looking at each other carefully, sizing them up. Oh, here we go, push the button, see what happens. What do we expect happening? Yes, that's right. Our friend Shay got all soaking wet. Yeah, very, very human response there. Okay, so it's interesting about the prisoner's dilemma. What was it that, in a sense, had you start with that in the beginning? What was the thing that sort of led you to that at the beginning, Tom?
It was one of the things I was reading about, but this one got to me in a particular way because some of you may be aware of a series of prisoner's dilemma competitions in which scores of academics offered their optimum tactic for playing a reiterated game. I was reading about the prisoner's dilemma a lot, and for example, there's a long section about it in The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. But what struck me about what I was reading was that it was premised on the idea that each prisoner was essentially only interested in his own advantage, which seemed to leave out a lot of human behavior and a lot of human instinct. And so you got a little kind of sense of that in the scene which the actors just read. And so I wanted to write, to put it briefly, I wanted to write about somebody who was good. And in the first scene, she's saying that without irony. She's not being smart or clever. When he says, why on earth would you do such a thing? It's not one of the options. And she says, because I'm good. Now, it gets more complicated because she has emotional layers. She has an emotional hidden life which accounts for a desire to be good. And she, in fact, decides to try to be good as a kind of bet with herself in the end. However, that is the partial answer to the question. That's what interested me in it. What I was interested in was the possibility of altruism, which is, as you all know, is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, disadvantaging yourself for somebody else's advantage.
Okay, we'll go on.
It happens in nature all the time, of course, but all the biologists here, and anybody else for that matter nowadays, is pretty familiar with the idea that the appearance of altruism can very often be resolved into a secret agenda for one's own advantage. When I say my own, I'm speaking in the persona of a mammal or a vegetable, insect. The idea that that you appear to be sacrificing yourself in order to give your genes an advantage in the long race towards human extinction is a very powerful idea. It's got more. My answer to the question really has so many corners to it that it would take too long to negotiate them all. But there's no common agreement, I think, even now, as to whether as animals we are behaving for the advantage of the group or the individual. I think that there are some very distinguished scientists who've changed sides on that particular question. I think Edward Wilson would be an example, Richard Hamilton. It's an endlessly fascinating subject, and you really and truly don't have to write plays to get into it. It's not necessary.
Well, I think this might be a good time to bring on scene 2. As usual in the play, things get rapidly more complicated and intense. So I'll ask our actors to come back up and do a reading of scene 2.
Carey and I will give the actors notes if you will hold with us.
We'll stop and critique.
Scene 2. Hilary's bedsit, night. The only light is from a candle by the bed. Hilary is kneeling by the bed, saying her prayers. Spike enters with 2 mugs of coffee. He is wearing a girly wrap-over negligee. Seeing Hilary at her prayers, he is dumbfounded. Hilary finishes praying and gets into bed, unbothered by seeing Spike.
Sorry,
What about?
were you praying?
Yes?
Sorry if I came in at the wrong moment.
I was saying my prayers. I wasn't putting in my dentures.
She takes the mug.
Thanks.
I'm glad you did that after, not before.
I feel the same way about what you're wearing.
They each take a sip of coffee and wordlessly exchange mugs.
You're lovely. It was lovely. Afterwards you muttered really, did you know? You said, thank you. Thank you. I thought that was so... You don't have to say thank you.
Actually, I wasn't talking to you.
Oh, sorry. So you, as it were, pray to God then?
Yes.
Do you pray every night?
Yes. Usually before I get into bed.
Oh. Does it work?
Yes.
You find prayer works?
Yes.
What, every time?
Yes, every time I say my prayers, I feel better.
Oh, works, right. Psychological.
Wow, Spike, I never thought of that. Missed it completely. Shit, that explains it. Hello. When I clap my hands, you will wake up and find you're in bed with a student wearing a negligee.
Lucky me. Well, better than when? What do you pray for?
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness? I thought it was me who should be doing that. What you need to pray for is getting into the Kroll Institute. How does God feel about your model of nature-nurture convergence in egoistic and altruistic parent-offspring behavior, huh? Does he think you're on the right lines?
I'll tell you what, Spike. If I were up for a back and forth about God, I'd rather not have it with an arsehole. Where we were was you were supposed to be checking the maths for me.
To tell you the truth, I feel a bit thrown now. I wasn't expecting to deal with a rival hypothesis.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not thrown by sharing an ancestor with a grunting chimpanzee. Evolution by natural selection? Bring it on. It's just that millions of years later, the chimp is still grunting, and you're using words like hypothesis. So I'm wondering if they've left something out. It's nothing for you to be bothered by.
If not me, who? I'm Darwin. I'm Mendel. I'm Crick and Watson. I stand for all the science that's taught. We've scraped you clean of gibberish. We've taken you to bits and put you back together from the atoms upwards so you understand how you work and everything around you works. We've accounted for every particle in the universe, except for dark matter, and we're working on that. And here you are on your knees to what? To who? You might as well pray to Peter Rabbit.
Explain consciousness.
Apart from consciousness. Explain consciousness. There's no baby, there's only bathwater. I've got nothing personal against God, except the usual, but I expected better from you. When did your mind turn into a party balloon? You've made it nearly to the end of the journey. Give it a couple more years and we'll have gravity wrapped in with all the other forces, and there'll be nothing for science to do except collect new beetles. Well, I don't believe that entirely. In fact, I'm so disgusted, I've started talking bollocks.
Explain consciousness.
Spike takes her finger and holds it to the flame of the candle.
Flame, finger, brain. Brain, finger, ouch, consciousness.
Brilliant. Now do sorrow.
Oh, my God.
You think you've done pain. If you wired me up, you could track the signal. Zip, zip. If you put my brain into a scanner, you could locate the activity. Ping, pain. Now do sorrow. How do I feel sorrow?
Do you feel sorrow?
Yes.
I'm making you sad.
Not everything is about you, Spike.
Right.
Spike opens Hillary's laptop and taps keys.
Scaredy cat. You can explain the mechanics. You should work in a garage. It's your big end's gone, mate. Does it hurt when I do this? An answer came then none because it's a bloody car. I don't go looking for an argument with science. Tell me my DNA is 70% banana and I think, well, fine. There are more things in heaven and earth than I dreamt of in your philosophy, Hillary. But with consciousness, with the mind-body problem, the God idea shoves itself to the front like a doctor at the scene of an accident. Because when you come right down to it, the body is made of things. And things don't have thoughts. Bananas aren't thinking, hey, 7/8 are 56, or I'm not the king of Spain.
But it's pathetic to rely on a supreme being to underwrite what you call your values. Why are you afraid of making your own?
You don't claim to make your own. What's the difference between a supreme being and being programmed by your biology?
Freedom. I can override the programming.
Who can? Who is the you outside your brain? Where? The mind is extra.
The human brain, for its size, is the most complex...
Object on the planet, in the galaxy, in the universe. Forget it, Spike, I've got the t-shirt. If organising enough components in the right way is all it takes, then maybe a thermostat is a kiddie step towards consciousness, which
Maybe.
is what I'm... Did you just say maybe?
I don't see anything obviously wrong with that.
You believe a thermostat has consciousness potential, but you find God a bit of a stretch?
Uh-huh. But you should stick with God. Your way with an equation would require his collaboration. Oh, there's
it
more.
keeps going. That was such a good one. That's what you're here for. God can only do so much. I put in for 6 research slots in industry, plus Imperial College for the hell of it, and the Kroll for sheer cheek, and only the Kroll has offered me an interview.
The Kroll didn't know about your maths.
I'm not even doing what I'd call brain science.
You must be, seeing as it's the Kroll Institute for Brain Science, which means neurobio, neuropsycho, neuro-everything, plus its own gym, organic vegetables, and free Pilates, I'm told. All paid for by a squillionaire with a master's in biophysics who decided to try hedge funding. Which raises an interesting question. Is Kroll an altruist or an egoist? Ooh, what you've got here is a wonky covariance, miss.
What's wrong with it?
The model works okay for behavior one-on-one in an idealized sort of way. Think Raphael's Madonna and Child, which I personally call woman maximizing gene survival. But it won't generalize because you haven't allowed for future offspring. And if they have different fathers, you'll need to differentiate.
Can you fix it by Wednesday?
Do my best, miss, but I'll have to strip her right down to get at it. And that's just the customer.
Can you?
Also, it's not good science to call mother love a virtue, or even mother love.
You don't think mother love is a virtue?
You don't call it a virtue because at root its virtue consists in its utility.
Utility? Mother love?
Genetically selected behavior to maximize...
Spike, do you know anyone who believes that, really and truly?
I don't know anyone who doesn't believe it. Parental behavior. Hardwired when we were roaming the savannah in small groups of hunter-gatherers. Mother and baby are in a cost-benefit competition. Have you ever seen a newborn infant screaming to be fed? The anger, the noise, the face. The kid is laying it on, and it probably started in the womb.
Oh, probably. The kid doesn't know up from down, but it knows how to maximize the survival of its genes. And mummy's genes are working out the odds of their survival in the baby against her chances of having more kids. It's cost-benefit competition, and the genes, unlike some of us, can do the maths. Is that it?
Well...
Oh, just shut up.
It's not personal. Obviously, genes have no intentions. It's as if. It's a metaphor.
A metaphor for what?
A reflex. A survival reflex.
Genes don't have a survival problem, Spike. They're genes. They're tiny little things, like, I don't know, molecules. Metaphorically, genes want to hop on the next train before the train they're on conks out, as if they know life has a value that extinction doesn't have. But the science has no underneath. It's tortoises all the way down. I agree with you, Spike. Virtue is not science. You can't get an ought out of an is. Morality is not science. So there must be something else that isn't science, that science isn't. What is it?
Wait.
He brings a bucket-sized bin from under the table and places it on the table in front of her and stands back.
Moral rules are the stable strategy evolved by millions of years of jockeying between humans in real-life situations like the game of Prisoner's Dilemma.
She pretends to retch in the bin.
That's right, better out than in.
Hillary straightens up with the bin over her head. She stands there like that.
You don't like the idea that you're nothing else but an animal. It's a conceit. You're an animal. Get over it. Hilly? What?
After a moment, she takes the bin off her head.
What happened?
Nothing happened. I'm okay, Spike.
Of course you are. It'll be fine.
Oh, that? Forget that. I need a miracle.
Can I explain the tortoise?
Yes.
I mean, I don't know whether everybody cottoned on to that line about the tortoises, but it's a nice story which I can tell very briefly. It was when Bertrand Russell, as a young man, gave a public lecture on cosmology, and when he sat down, an elderly lady in the audience got up and told him that he seemed to be under a huge misapprehension because the Earth was actually balanced on the back of a large tortoise. And she sat down again. And he got up and said, perhaps the lady would like to tell us what the tortoise is standing on. And sat down, and she got up and said, "You think you're a very clever young man, but it's tortoises all the way down." As a matter of fact, I sometimes claim, and mostly with truth, that I really have no interest in putting anything into my plays which is not common currency. And that's an exception. I don't really expect everybody in the audience to know what she says when she says his tortoises all the way down. But I loved the story so much, I kind of broke my own rule for once. And the first person who directed this play read it and didn't know what on earth that referred to and was really rather angry. But he looked it up, and when he read the story, he couldn't resist it either, so it's still there.
I think I want to talk a little more about the science before we get on to some other topics. The existence of the hard problem is, of course, actually, there's a dispute among scientists about whether it's a hard problem or not. And I think it's a good classic case where science is actually full of argumentation as much as realization. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about that dispute briefly, and then we can go on. So one of the people that's been sort of adamant that Chalmers was not right is the philosopher Daniel Dennett. And he likes to point out that actually there's an awful lot of stuff going on in our brain, in our minds, that we don't even pay attention to, that's much more ephemeral and not even well understood. And one of the examples he shows is something called change blindness, which we also have an exhibit about. But this one I'm going to bring into the room. So if they can project change blindness, we'll see if this will go on the screen here. It'll take them a while. There we go. So this is a scene, and if you watch the scene, you'll see a blink every so often. Just take a look at the scene. Sort of looks like a scene with just a flash. Nothing much happening, just kind of a straightforward scene. Now I'm going to ask them to take the blink off. You'll see something strange happening every so often. I'm going to unblink it. Nope, it's still blinking. There we go. And just watch what happens in this scene. You see things happening? Now, if I put the blink on again, those same kinds of changes are happening in the scene, but you don't notice them. Now, Dennett used this as a counterpoint to Chalmers, and effectively what he's saying is, it's an odd thing, here's something else happening in your brain that's pretty amazing that we don't understand, but also we don't perceive. He was trying to make the argument that there are things we don't perceive that happen in our brain, and that the argument that consciousness, because it is not necessarily a higher order thing or doesn't take more difficulty to explain, we may not understand it well, but he's sort of saying these things are probably understandable, they're part of our hardwiring, and therefore consciousness is most likely part of that too. And so he didn't believe it was a hard problem at all. And other scientists have sort of said the same thing. What I think is interesting about this is it's an argument in science, and so whether this is a hard problem or not is even an argument. And Tom, you said recently that your job for many years is to present both sides of the argument. That's what good theater is. It's good gymnasium for the mind. Obviously, you're talking even about mind and body, but here, even in science, you have these different sides of arguments. So I think getting around all of this to a question is, it seems to me many of your plays, it's really about different sides and the way the audience almost has to make up their mind which side they're on or how they're connected. I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of both sides of the argument, or sort of what you're really interested in talking about in the plays that you do, like this.
Yeah, I mean, all the time I'm trying to. Oh, sorry. You know, even in this play, where I've got a young woman as a kind of spokesperson, I'm trying to give her good points to make, and so I'm presenting myself as her impresario in a strange way when I do an interview or talk to you and so on, or even actually to the actors and to Carey. In fact, I can see quite well, and I'm not blind to what's happening on the other side of the argument, and the other side of the argument doesn't yet make enough sense, but I'm not insensitive to the view that this is just a matter of incremental advances in knowledge, and in time we'll understand everything. I don't quite go there myself, so I think that my inner self stands on one side of the argument. As it happens, in this play, as you saw, there's a notion termed God, which serves to represent what we can't get our minds around. And I'm with her on that. But in previous plays, in fact, all my writing life, probably, since Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I've been writing arguments. I've been writing duologues, ping-pong pages, you know, bang, bang, ding, ding. And I'm possibly the last person to make a judgment about why I would find that natural and even attractive. But I think that an obvious possibility is that I began and continue to feel a lack of complete security in my own views, answers, opinions, everything you like. People credit me with a sort of cleverness, but actually I tend to agree with the last person who spoke.
I'll remember that.
Do you get hate mail from either side?
Do I get what?
Hate mail from either side in these cases?
No, absolutely not hate mail, no. I think that, you know, I have a lot of correspondence of a sort, or even just social interactions. And I've written 2 or 3 times about what is in other hands very serious science. In my own way, I've written about chaos mathematics, quantum physics, and so on in different plays. And I find that people like you are very, because this gentleman is really a physicist, actually. I find that proper scientists are wonderfully kind and interested and absolutely, you know, the few who actually are invited to come and talk to a company of actors like you invite. My experience in England has been that they're really very pleased to be asked. But Robert May came to talk to the first company of the Arcadia actors and started trying to, you know, go through a little bit about the mathematics of biology at his level, and he said, I'm going to explain this to you, an absolute sort of rock bottom primitive. You have to accept that this is going to be a sort of approximation, because I'm trying to put this across at the very lowest level of comprehensibility. Then he started, and after about a minute, he stopped and he realized that no, there was a level lower than that. We were all very anxious to learn what he was talking about.
So, Carey, I have a question for you. In your book, you say preparing a dramaturgical work for one of your plays, Tom's plays, is like a graduate seminar. You know, what's it like to sort of actually tackle a play like this and start to put it on stage?
I mean, I'm a pretty litigious person too, so I love this stuff. You know, I'm married to a Brit, so we argue all the time. I will say this though. I mean, obviously, in any of these universes, the worlds that you enter require some degree of study, which is always kind of wonderful. You know, the best thing about being a director is that you learn something completely different every time you do a play. But these would not be interesting plays if they were essays about these subjects. Do you know? And I want to say this because I think this is why there are lots of people who write plays about science and the plays are deadly. So it isn't that choosing the subject actually makes it interesting drama. The material is fascinating, but what is it that actually makes something interesting dramatically? So I think if you think about a play like Arcadia, which is probably a play you all know better than this, which is a newer play, the thing that's sort of fantastic to me about Tom's work is that it always traffics in the irrational. And that's where human experience becomes interesting, right? So he writes a lot about desire, love, sexuality, and irrational behavior. And in the theater, we've been trained in a sort of psychological realism that says that an actor has to know what they want before they act upon the stage. But actually, the amazing thing about human experience is how often we behave in a certain way and don't know why we're behaving that way. Or we do something irrational. You know, look at the way Americans vote, which is completely irrational and totally a gift. Forget this election. But, you know, I remember when I read What is the Matter with Kansas, or whatever the name of that book is, and how most people vote against their own economic interests. So irrationality is a very fascinating thing about human experience, why people behave a certain way. And that's where the drama comes from. So this woman in the play is not simply interested in the nature of altruism because intellectually it interests her, or in the abstract she's religious, but because, well, spoiler alert, do we give away? Anyway, you're going to see the play. You better see the play. We've seen you all here. You better come. But she's had a child that she had to give away. And so there is a trauma in her life which leads her to try and lead her life in a particular way. And so there's certain things that she does or feels that may or not be rational in another setting. And so as a director, that's where the gold is. I mean, that's where you sort of dig. Do you know what is the undercurrent under the argument that leads someone that way, right? And that's Thomasina and Septimus in Arcadia. Do you know? So why does she become fascinated in the way that he thinks? Because she falls in love with him and he with her, right? And he makes the leap and begins to understand why the coffee can't be, you know, unstirred, because he falls into her mind. So those things are what you can put on stage. And that's what you watch when you watch a play, is humanity wrestling with itself. And that's interesting.
Do you find it hard to, I mean, there is all of this also intellectual part in the play going on. Is it hard to sort of, I don't know, get that in some sense?
I mean, here's the truth. You have to have actors smart enough to act like they know what they're talking about. That's all. You know, we had, and it's, I mean it, you know, and actors look for behavior. We had Fritz Capra when we did, you know, wrote the Tao of Physics, when we did Chaos Theory, when we did Arcadia, and he was talking, and I realized the actors weren't listening to one word he was saying. They were just watching his behavior. Then we had, 2 weeks ago, we had Alison Gopnik, behavioral psychologist, and Linda Welbrecht, is that her name? Is that right? Who's a wonderful neuroscientist, and they came together to talk to the cast, and what the cast was watching was how they behaved. How they behaved to each other, the difference between the behavioral psychologist and the neuroscientist, who's shut up, who talked, how they dressed. And they took away all of that, and they've built what they thought around that, and then they can embody it and pretend they know what they're talking about. And if they're good actors, you believe it. That's all, right?
That's awesome, someone said. But maybe along the same vein, is it hard work to connect the ideas to the plot and the characters, Tom? Tom, is that hard work or hard work for you or not? I guess that's the question. It's all hard work, I know, but.
Much earlier this evening, I think I said that you don't really have a play until you have a story. And the problem is you don't really have a story till you have a play. Obviously, what I just said wouldn't be true if you made up the story before you began in every corner and got all the kind of aspects of it, and then you'd write it. I think that would be hard. The way to write a play, ideally, funny enough, it's not as hard as that because you're just being led along. You're not having to lead it. You're not having to drive it here, then drive it there, and don't forget that, and pick up that. And years and years ago, I just found my way to understanding that if you just get something down on paper, it will kind of tell you what should happen next. You shouldn't be telling it. That can't be absolutely true. It's not intended to sound absolutely true in every case. But it's certainly the case that, in the case of my plays anyway, I found the ones that work out best are the ones where I haven't really understood where we were going. And I'm, to a very great degree, the beneficiary of staying out of the way of that particular truth. You know, I wrote a play. I was interested by what you were saying about, Septimus falling in love and talking of blah, blah. I mean, I wrote another play which was partly about communism in Czechoslovakia, partly about rock and roll, and it had a bit of this in it. It had a bit of Sappho in the literature of antiquity. I don't know, Marxism. I don't know what it didn't have, but when the whole thing was over and done and being performed, I sort of understood for the first time that it was a love story. And that's what it was, between two people. And so what I'm saying is that, and I've said this before more than once, that when you finish any play, I think, you just kind of see how things come out. It's really good news for the play if you feel lucky, but it's not very good news for the play if you feel clever.
That's great. I want to tell a little story. I had the great fortune of attending a rehearsal for the scene we just saw. And at the end of the scene, the cast members, out of character, spontaneously began to address the questions that the play presented. And we had an interesting, brief discussion about it. And I wanted to bring that up because I'm really fascinated. The exhibits in the Exploratorium are designed to stimulate inquiry. They present aspects of the natural world, of the human phenomena, and they encourage you to ask your own questions, test ideas. And it seems to me that plays have this enormous power of doing the same thing, of stimulating inquiry on the part of audiences. And to me, that makes it fantastically interesting, almost from an educational perspective, as well as an entertainment and an enjoyment and a life perspective. So there's a question in there somewhere, which is, I think that the relationship of the audience and the play itself is fascinating to me as an opportunity for thinking about ideas, including thinking about ideas in science, for example, and as well as the ideas we're talking about. So I don't know if you have thoughts about the relationship of the play to the audience.
I feel like every time I'm working on a play, I read everything through the lens of that play. So I end up bringing every day to rehearsal whatever I read in the newspaper that morning, or something I've discovered, or I hand Tom another book, or whatever. We give each other things. And, right now, we have a huge kind of wrestle going on about what is ethical and why our public institutions have no ethical basis anymore, right? So we've just watched, the biggest California bank being pulled down by unbelievably unethical behavior, such that the relationship of a bank as a place that secures your money and the notion, of boundless greed has no link anymore. I mean, and so this question about altruism versus egoism, and in a personal way or in a public way, and that's true of all kinds of things in public life. Now, journalism. We used to believe journalism was a profession with ethics where people had to fact check and you said things that you thought were true. And that's totally untethered now. Journalism is whatever anybody wants to say on Fox News or whatever, it goes, and that's a real change in the culture. What happens when things that you thought had kind of professional ethics, my husband talks about this all the time, and the legal profession, become untethered from those ethics. And you have to ask those questions then. Is there such a thing as the good? Or what is morality? And how do people behave? And then, we wrestle with technology and in relation to the human experience. And so I think this play does make you sit and think enormously about all the things that are out there in your exhibit about groupthink, and if everybody ignores somebody lying on the street, then everybody will ignore them, that film you have out there. But if one person stops to look, then finally other people do stop to look, and what it takes, what unconscious bias is. I mean, this is a great exhibit, by the way. I'm sure you've all seen it, but it's kind of amazing what they've done here about these subjects. And of course, drama makes you experience them emotionally rather than just intellectually, so you live through that. And I think that's sort of an incredible gift. And I found with our audiences, they really wrestle with it. There's a funny thing in the play, because the hedge fund guy is the guy who's paid for the Brain Science Center. And so Hillary keeps saying, so is Kroll altruistic or egoistic? I'll have to test him for ultimate motivation. And we all deal with this all the time in terms of philanthropy. That's a really interesting question. So none of these will be abstract. I don't think anything that the play raises will be an abstract question. I think these are things that we think about right now, we sitting here in California or in the world, or Brexit, the breathless selfishness that has led to Brexit, and now the mess that it's left. I mean, these are things that we're sort of needing to solve. So it actually matters whether there's such a thing as consciousness, and where values come from, I think matters now more than ever.
That's a great comment, because I also think, the play is sort of so timely. It's amazingly timely in terms of the world that we're living in. I mean, I walked away with those same feelings about how to think about the world through this lens. And I think maybe now's the time to ask a few questions, let the audience have a few questions. So maybe turn the lights on a bit out here in the wonderful Canbar Forum. And we have someone with a microphone. Fran has the mic. We need to have the mic. So anyone, raise your hand. Anybody with a question? There's a couple over there. Coming your way.
I'm going to hold on to the mic.
Melissa's stage managing the audience participation.
Hi. It's an absolutely fascinating discussion that's going on in the scenes of the play. And pardon me if you address this later on in the play, but there's a certain sense in which things from evolutionary psychology are only true in the environment that our ancestors were in. And so it seems that we've accidentally become a lot more altruistic than our genes would have wanted us to be for the world we live in today. And that might be, part of the answer of why we have aspirations towards all of humanity where our genes might not benefit individually from that. I don't know if that's a thing that's addressed as well. I'm sorry, that wasn't really a question. But
well, I think a lot came out of the David Sloan Wilson studies of the selfish gene versus the altruistic group, right? From David Sloan Wilson, and sort of the altruism of the group versus
Right.
the selfishness of the gene. I mean, that's sort of there somewhere in the play.
You see, the notion that as a whole we behave more altruistically than our biology would I'm trying not to be anthropomorphic, you know, than our biology would wish, for example. I don't know whether that's actually an accepted truth about the world at the moment. I was amazed to read that the world is now supposedly much less violent than it was in the past. Yeah, is that the impression we all have? Is that must be much more to do with communication? That it must be more to do with the development of our ability to communicate across long distances instantaneously. And that would mean what? That people just didn't really know what was going on 100 miles away in the past, but actually terrible things were happening all the time, and so on and so on. I'm slightly skating on the ice here because I didn't, what you said was interesting, and yet I didn't actually bring from it a question in any sort of, it does you credit, but there was no question at the end of it that I could take on board, you know? And I can't even find you now.
That's the
there you go.
mystery
Sorry,
of
thank you.
consciousness.
Yeah.
Sir. Yeah, let's go to the next one.
We'll try another one.
Hi, fascinating conversation. I was thinking about E.O. Wilson, you mentioned in passing earlier, who's one of my favorite biologists. I heard him speak recently, and one of the reflections that I found most compelling was that we'll never resolve the problem of sin because it's the tension of egoism and passing on our genes, and virtue is working on the behalf of the group. And as a social species, those will always be in tension. And that it's not about resolving sin so much as making sure that they're in an adequate balance that's not too destructive. My question is, the philosophy and science in your plays is endlessly interesting. And I'm curious whether you start with the science and the ideas and the philosophy and then bring the drama to it, or if you use the ideas and the philosophy and the science to somehow explicate the drama.
Well, that's a good question. You've talked about that. I mean, I think you know, do you start with the ideas and sort of find characters to embody them, or you start with characters and the ideas come out of character?
I think there are indeed lots of writers who start off from character, but I don't consider myself to be particularly clever about conveying very distinctive characters. It's actually because I'm interested in ideas and the history of ideas. I probably shouldn't, you know, I shouldn't say this, but I don't mind if a character is more or less a stereotype, because I just want somebody to represent. I'll write the stuff for you, I'm thinking, you know, I'll really write it very nicely for you, and there'll be jokes, all stuff, everything. But I really have no interest in your backstory. There is a very rich theme of theatre, which I'm certainly not feeling condescending towards, which is very much about backstory. And I think that although I don't serve them very well myself, I completely understand how an actor would find a backstory useful and perhaps necessary to rounding off a character. And I'm just sitting there saying, I don't know, that's, here is why you can't square this circle. I literally would have been quite a thing in writing a prisoner's dilemma play, and it would be about two prisoners. And what one should try to do is to resist that and understand the potential of the metaphor, because a lot of drama is metaphor.
But I'm going to totally disagree with you, because I've done so many of your plays, and you know, the thing, you are a very particular observer of human experience, and I think you're incredibly interested in people, and so you don't think of yourself as a character writer, but they are, there's a reason actors have a really good time doing the plays, and it's because they actually are really well-observed people doing interesting or caring about interesting things. So I think, I mean, I remember when you said, we were doing Night and Day, I don't know if you remember that play, which is about a war correspondent in Africa, and Tom said, well, if I write an African dictator, I have to conspire to make him be the most articulate African dictator ever, because it has to sound, because my characters all sound like me, and or something like. And the Dustman, I think you said it had to be an articulate.
No, my idea
dustman.
of character is to just tell people he went to the LSE, that's the London School of Economics, because all African dictators go to the London School of Economics. It's no big deal. But, you know, I'd just like them to get their syntax right.
That's right. The syntax is really important. But that doesn't mean they're not fully blown characters.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I'm aware that I don't really mean that I go out of my way to write stereotypes. What I mean is that first of all, you know, we rely on actors to embody not just the speeches of a person, but to embody the person in a whole way. So they do a lot of the work. And all I was trying to do is, I would make a distinction. You know, say Alan Bennett in The Old Lady with the Van. You know, that is character study of a very high order. And I don't think I'm actually meant for that. I don't think I'm good at that. I'm better at seeing two sides of an argument and trying to make both sides worth listening to. But I like love too.
And sex.
And sex. Yeah, I'm very prudish actually. I'm getting less so nowadays. But I mean, as to what you're.
But my very first encounter with Tom was, I wrote a series of questions about Arcadia when I was directing it, just things that I wasn't sure I understood, and he wrote back and said, "Oh, alas, it's a sexual metaphor." Do you remember? I thought, oh, okay. So now whenever I don't get it in the play, I think, it's a sexual metaphor. Move on. About date rape, you remember? Yeah. Anyway, all right.
Let's go time for one more question, I think, and see where the mic goes.
While the mic is traveling, can I just say thank you to you and to all of you. What a wonderful place to visit.
To Schaefer, who made it happen wherever he is.
Yeah.
Thank you, Schaefer. Woo!
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Rex.
Yeah, this is what all characters should be like the Exploratorium, beautiful and interesting.
We'll quote you on that. We'll put it on our ads.
Well, after all these rather heady questions, I'm going to ask a deceptively simple one. You write about fiction, or you write about science, you write fiction, you write about the history of ideas. Have you ever considered yourself a science fiction writer?
Science fiction?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, it's weird. Not at all.
I'm not surprised.
Dr. Jonathan Miller, who was a doctor and director of great distinction, years and years ago, I remember reading him on this subject. He said the thing about science fiction is it's like pornography in that you're not really being asked to believe it. And that's really at the heart of it. I also don't think I have much of a visual imagination, which I think is really important in science fiction, and very, very often.
Oh, I dispute that one too. I'll just tell you one other thing before we finish. What's really fun, I would love having Tom in rehearsal, and sometimes he'll sit and stare at something and puzzle it out, and I think, what is he thinking? And he'll say, you know, if you moved the chair before you said the word, or something like that. Or he'll see something. You love tech rehearsals. Yes, you love lighting. He'll suddenly think, oh, that could be a lighting cue. That could be, oh, you could get rid of that line because it would be better if it were a piece of pop music, or, you know. So I think actually.
It's just the nicest thing almost about theatre is that you have these opportunities where you can come back to a piece, and with the cooperation and collaboration of the director and the actors, you can make adjustments to it. I mean, I always think how jealous a novelist must be that, you know, he can walk into a bookshop and just change his mind about page 137.
We do it all the time.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful thing.
Well, with that, I think...
Do you know that one out there about the surgeon says, I can't operate on this person because this person is my son?
Please tell me you figured that out.
I didn't. I absolutely fell straight into this little trap designed for...
Which is called unconscious bias.
But I have got jet lag.
Well, with that, I think let's thank Carey and Tom.